Hello everyone, this is Mr. Laubach. In this video, we are going to go over the rise and the presidency of Ronald Reagan. So a couple of things to keep in mind as we move forward here. Reagan was a likable guy that ushered in a new wave of conservatism. This often was called New Conservatism, and he attracted many that were not typically Republicans to the Republican Party. Reagan promised to shrink the federal government, but due to military spending and tax cuts, ended up raising the federal debt significantly. Reagan is often credited with ending the Cold War and doing it without firing a shot. The Reagan administration was not without scandal, which came most notably in the form of the Iran-Contra affair. So let's start with the election of 1980. President Carter waged his campaign for re-election in 1980, weighed down by a poor economy and the Iran crisis. Despite this, he was able to turn back a challenge for the Democratic nomination from Senator Edward Kennedy, brother of Robert F. Kennedy and John F. Kennedy. For the GOP, the veteran conservative champion Ronald Reagan easily captured the Republican nomination. Reagan hammered Carter's record and vowed to restore American military strength while at the same time cutting taxes. Reagan also promised to devolve power from the federal government back to the states. He openly appealed to traditional conservative values such as patriotism and support for the nuclear family, which seemed to be underappreciated in the 1970s post-Watergate years. Reagan's message resonated with many voters, and he won a decisive victory, both with the popular vote and the Electoral College, as you can see in this map. The states that Reagan won are in red, of course. The election of 1980 was a turning point. The New Deal Democratic coalition that had dominated electoral politics on the national level for almost half a century began to fall apart. Ronald Reagan won the votes of many traditional Democrat blue-collar workers who had been alienated from their party because of its liberal position on abortion, sexual freedom, and affirmative action. These displaced Democrats became known as Reagan Democrats. Reagan successfully associated liberalism with the cultural upheaval, economic malaise, and international embarrassments of the 1970s. Members of the religious right, offended by challenges to traditional morality, started to vote overwhelmingly for the Republican Party. Often politically and culturally more conservative than voters in other parts of the country, white Southerners continued a historic shift from the Democratic to the Republican parties. Thanks to these broad political trends, the new right heavily influenced American politics in the ensuing decades, beginning with helping to elect a Republican majority in the Senate, along with Ronald Reagan in 1980. So let's go back a little bit. Why was Ronald Reagan so appealing to the American voters at this point in history? Reagan stressed the positive aspects of America, and this appeared to contrast what Carter was doing, as he was seen as being negative. His likable can-do attitude appealed even to those who disagreed with his politics. So a lot of people liked Reagan, even though they did not like his politics, maybe. He presented himself as an outsider. Ironically, so too did Jimmy Carter 4 years previously. But the outsider label really stuck with Reagan. Ronald Reagan was a masterful communicator who helped transform American politics. He was known by many as the Great Communicator. He used skills developed as an actor in Hollywood during the 1930s and 1940s to effectively shape and deliver his message to many different audiences. As president, Reagan set general policy and left the details of implementing this to his capable subordinates. Reagan implemented a bold economic agenda. He persuaded Congress to cut federal taxes by 5% in 1981 and another 10% in the two following years. The president was an adherent of the theory of supply-side economics. He believed that tax cuts would enable wealthier Americans to put more money back into the economy, spurring economic growth and job creation. This prosperity, in turn, would lead to higher tax revenue because even at lower tax rates, there would be more money to tax. To stimulate investment, capital gains taxes were lowered, meaning the tax on profits of money invested in things like the stock market. The Reagan administration also continued the process of deregulation begun in the Carter years, easing regulation in such industries as banking, cable television, and long-distance phone services. All of this economic policy quickly became known as Reaganomics, was also known as the trickle-down economy. Liberals denounced President Reagan's economic priorities. Anticipating low initial tax revenue, the Reagan administration cut funds for such programs as urban housing and aid to education and the arts. At the same time, Reagan poured an additional $13 billion into the defense budget. The president also received a great deal of criticism for his expensive Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, which was nicknamed Star Wars. The goal of this program was to develop defenses that could shoot down enemy missiles before they struck the American homeland. While technologically overambitious in Reagan's day, this program eventually led to significant breakthroughs in missile defense. Another contentious Reagan policy was new federalism. His administration gave states greater control over how federal money was spent within their borders. So he shifted a lot of the power of the federal government to states. Environmentalists were incensed when he cut funding for the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. Labor activists were angered when Reagan fired air traffic controllers who defied a federal statute by engaging in a strike. Reagan was determined to reverse what he believed was the weakness of American foreign policy in the 1970s. He believed the United States could win the Cold War. His military buildup was intended to restore American military superiority over the Soviet Union. He outraged newspaper editorialists by calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, but his rhetorical frankness pleased many voters. When the Marxist government of the Caribbean island of Grenada collapsed into civil war in 1983, Reagan sent troops to the island. Grenada was an easy American victory. A peacekeeping mission in Lebanon ended less happily when a suicide truck attack killed 251 American servicemen at a Marine base. President Reagan was in a strong position when he ran for re-election in 1984. After a deep recession from 1981 through 82, the economy bounced back and was booming. Reagan's personal popularity remained high. He had won the hearts of many with his gusty behavior after being shot by a deranged assassin in 1981. Reagan's Democratic opponent was Walter Mondale, who had served as Jimmy Carter's vice president. Mondale picked Congresswoman Geraldine Ferraro as his running mate, the first woman to be nominated to run on a major party's presidential ticket. Mondale criticized Reagan's supply-side economics and conceded that he would raise taxes. Reagan campaigned on the theme that it was morning again in America. Prosperity and Reagan's nationalistic revival of American pride at home and abroad made him politically irresistible to American voters. He crushed Mondale in the election, claiming almost 60% of the popular vote and winning all of the electoral votes, except those in Minnesota, which was Mondale's home state, and the District of Columbia. In his second term, Reagan pursued deeper tax cuts. The Revenue Act of 1986 further reduced federal tax rates. That of the wealthiest Americans fell from 50% to 28%. In this period, economic good times continued, with both unemployment and inflation falling. Reagan wanted to appoint conservative justices to the Supreme Court. He nominated William Rehnquist to serve as Chief Justice. He also nominated Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman appointee to the High Court, as well as Justices Antonin Scalia and Anthony Kennedy. Reagan also faced challenges in his second term. On Black Monday, October 19, 1987, the stock market saw a sudden and dramatic 20% drop in stock prices. Although it did not stop economic growth, this was a troubling event. Also worrisome was the rise in the federal deficit as a result of tax cuts and heavy defense spending. In another disturbing development, for the first time since World War I, the United States began importing more goods than it was exporting. The Reagan administration was badly shaken by the Iran-Contra affair in 1986 and 1987. Shiite Muslims aligned with Iran had been taking American hostages in Lebanon. In order to gain Iranian assistance in securing the release of these hostages, the Reagan administration violated an official trade embargo and sold weapons to Iran. National Security Advisor John Poindexter and Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North and other administration officials then used the money from this arms for hostage scheme to assist Contra rebels in Nicaragua. This covert funding of the Contras defied congressional limits on support the Nicaraguan rebels. When these activities were discovered, Congress held nationally televised hearings. Several figures in the administration lost their jobs and faced legal penalties for their actions. President Reagan took responsibility for the Iran-Contra dealing, but he claimed that he did not know what his subordinates were up to. This made Reagan look like a detached figurehead in his own administration, and his poll numbers began to drop, and many speculated with his older age he was losing grip on his administration. Despite the criticism, Reagan bounced back. By Reagan's second term, the Soviets were finding it increasingly difficult to maintain their Cold War competition with the United States. The Soviet economy was beginning to collapse. Mikhail Gorbachev, a new and younger leader of the Soviet Union, worked to establish better relations with the United States. President Reagan proved receptive, and both gentlemen actually claimed that they were true friends. During this time, Gorbachev instituted a policy of glasnost, or openness. It allowed Soviet citizens to publicly criticize the government and discuss social problems in the hope of finding solutions. Another policy instituted by Gorbachev was perestroika, or restructuring. It introduced a limited free market economy to the Soviet Union's socialist plan economy, a key aspect of the Soviet Union's fall as a superpower. In 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, which called for both states to eliminate an entire class of missiles. That same year, Reagan traveled to Berlin, and speaking near the Berlin Wall, he demanded, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." By the time Reagan left office in January of 1989, the communist dictatorships of Eastern Europe were crumbling. Ronald Reagan, pictured here with his beloved wife, Nancy Reagan, was one of the most successful presidents in the modern era. Many Americans saw him as a great leader who revived American pride, defending traditional family values, revitalizing the economy, and winning the Cold War. Critics charged that Reagan's economic policies disproportionately benefited the wealthy and increased the gap between the rich and the poor. In 1988, this argument failed to resonate with the American public, and as a result, Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush's compelling advantage in that year's election was that he was representing a continuation of the policies of Ronald Reagan.